Hello and welcome. I'm Trumpetman, and you're listening to the 40 Card College Podcast, a podcast about advancing your limited game, whether you're a first time drafter or a trophy master. So, today on the podcast, and also on a live Twitch stream, slash going to be YouTube, also going to be on the Twitch VOD after. If you want to look at any of those video versions of this podcast, then there's lots of places that you can do that. We are going to be covering every single card in Phyrexia. All will be one. And so we're going to go through each and every card, and it's going to be a lot of fun and a lot of words. So we'll see just how many hours that ends up taking, but we're going to be here for a while. So what I'm going to do is, since I do have Twitch chat with me today, if anyone is commenting about any of the specific cards we are talking about, then I'm going to be able to answer those specific questions as they come up. But if it's on a different card, then I probably won't be talking about it, because we do want to make sure we're staying on topic with each individual card. So before we get into that, though, just a quick word on the Patreon. This project, 40 Card College, is completely patron supported, so I really do appreciate all the patrons who are already supporting 40 Card College. And also, always give a special shout out to the Add Up tier patrons and above, Marius and Adrian. Thank you so much for your support. Normally I put that at the end of the episode, but this is going to be a long one, so I'm putting it right here. In addition, this week on 40 Card College, there have been the Kaldheim Open events. So those ones I have been putting up on the YouTube. So the day 2 drafts, day 1 is already up. Day 2 is going up, should be pretty much up by the time you're listening at this. And you can check that out if you want to see some high stakes, limited Magic draft. All right, enough about that though, because again, the main reason we're here is we are going to be looking at every single card from Phyrexia. All will be one. And so let's hop right into it. Okay, first, how this all works is we have a grading scale. And so I just want to go over that really quickly. Change this. There, that's better. All right, we have a grading scale, A through F. And we are using the limited resources grading scale. Kind of the gold standard in the limited community, but in case you're not familiar with it, we're going to look at this one here. A is your game-winning bombs, like Titania's Command. B is so your sort of draws into a color, like Horned Stoneseeker. You're going to pick those cards relatively early, but they're not quite as efficient or game-winning as your A's. And then your C's, these are the cards that you're happy with in your deck. They're sort of archetype or color staples. They're going to make up the bulk of your deck. And so, but they serve a role. Like, they're not throwaways, and that's why most of the cards are going to be C's, especially as cards have gotten better over the course of the last, I don't know, 4 to 5 years. A lot of commons, like, we no longer like have C's as just being a throwaway, right? It makes up the bulk of your deck, but even if you look at something like Goblin Blast Runner, that might be something where it was like a C plus, but it's a really, really good card. And so it still fits in that C category. Whereas D's are kind of, you're not too happy about D's being in your deck. And so an example I picked was Takasia's Onulet. It's a fine card, that 4/4, 4/4 with Unearth from Brothers War. But when it did end up in your deck, unless you had like a really good reason to be playing it, you'd sort of be like, not really that fantastic. And then F's are the cards you never really want to put in your deck. Example, Ivory Tower. It's basically just you play it and it was a mulligan and did nothing. I'm also going to be putting a star for build around grades. So if you're looking back at this, there's going to be the entire presentation. You can always access it in view only mode. If you're not watching it on the podcast, or if you're not watching it on the YouTube, there's also a link on the Twitch channel, Twitch chat. If you just type in exclamation point presentation. So we have the builder on grids as a star, and then star for sideboard grades. So I'm going to be going through with that. And Um, oh, thank you, Trezio, for the sub. Appreciate that. So Clarm asks again, if it's on topic, if it's on the specific slide we're talking about, I am going to mention anything Twitch chat brings up. If it's not about that specific one, then we only have so much time in the day. But Clarm asks, set reviews. He says set reviews are great. He or she or they, sorry. I love developing blood feuds in the community over whether a 3 mana 2/3 is a C minus or a D plus. Um, so, a 3 mana 2/3. If that has like no abilities, I would probably like if it's just a random card. In my book, that's a D plus. Like it used to be, you could play a 3 mana 2/3 and it would be fine. It used to be in that C category, but I think these days we just need more out of our cards. So I would categorize that as a D plus. But that is a wonderful place to have a blood feud and be deciding about it. All right. So let's get into it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go through each color. We're going to start with the commons and uncommons. And a great place to start with these is the the two color signposts that let you kind of know what a specific color pair is all about. So the color pair signposts. So the first one up here is Bladehold War Whip. It's one red and a white for an artifact at uncommon, and it has the ability for Mirrodin. And what for Mirrodin means is when this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 red rebel creature token, then attach this to it. So we're going to see several equipment. I think all the equipment in the set have for Mirrodin. And so basically we're going to evaluate this card as the 2/2 for its cost and then whatever ability it comes attached with it. But then they also, you can move around the equipment and it's still going to function as an equipment. So anytime, we see these quote unquote like living equipments where they come into play with a creature attached to it, they tend to overperform and be really quite good. So what are we getting here for our one red and a white? You get the 2/2 attached to it, but what else does it get? Well, the equipped creature has double strike. So right off the bat, we have one red white for a 2/2 double strike. And it says equip abilities you activate of other equipment cost one less to activate. Probably not going to come up too much in limited because you need other equipment on top of this one, but it could happen. And then it has equip 3 red and a white. So really expensive on the equip cost, but you could give, anything else double strike, and that's going to be, meaningful place to put your mana into the late game. So a 1 red white 2/2 double strike already, that's like C plus B minus territory. And the fact that you could move this around, give something else double strike later on, and maybe even get the equipment discount for your other equipment, I would say this card is probably just a straight up B. So that's kind of where I'm going to start it right here. And we start off with Bladehold War Whip getting a B. All right. Heading to our next one. Again, anyone in the Twitch chat, if you want to follow along, we have the link to the presentation and you can see all our grades as we go along. All right, our next one is Cephalopod Sentry. So it's 2 white blue for a star 5 artifact creature Phyrexian squid at uncommon. It has flying, and Cephalopod Sentry's power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. So what do we get here? We get basically 4 mana for a 1/5 flyer all on its own. Pretty good blocker, obviously not a very good attacker. But really, how much do you really need for Cephalopod Sentry to sort of give back to, like, be good enough for it to be able to attack, to brawl, to win battles in the air, all that kind of stuff? And I think, like, for this card to be good, you really only need one other artifact in play because it can kind of sit there and then grow over time. So as long as you have one other artifact, you're paying 4 mana for a 2/5 flyer. And, like, again, that's going to make sure, like, any of your opponent's 3/2s aren't going to attack through it. And once you get to, 3/5, 4/5, and above, then this card really is kind of a house. So again, I mean, I think this one is a little bit more of a build around. Like, you can't just put this in any deck. I mean, you can, but a 4-mana 1/5 that has no potential to grow is pretty bad. However, it is the signpost uncommon, right, for blue-white. So blue and white are going to have a lot of the little toxic creature 1/1s, the mites that are going to be running around. There's even a 5-mana white angel that comes into play with that spots you 2 artifact creatures right off the bat. So if you curve this into that alone, you'd already have a 3/5 flyer on the Cephalopod Sentry. So I think overall, just a pretty good card, a pull into blue-white. I think, again, I think it being a 3/5 or better is kind of a B-level card, and that's kind of what you're aiming for. So I kind of just think it's another B. Like, nothing really too fancy about it, but let's kind of keep on moving with that one, and it'll rule the skies. All right. Quick swig of the water we have. Yeah, I don't think the blue-white uncommon, you don't really have to work too hard for it. Next up, we have Char Forger. This is the black-red signpost. It's 1 black-red for a 2/3 Phyrexian Beast at uncommon. When Char Forger enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature token. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Char Forger. Remove 3 oil counters from Char Forger. Exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So for 3 mana, you're getting a 2/3 plus a 1/1. That's already pretty good rate. Basically 3/4 worth of stats for 3 mana. Spread across 2 bodies even. Sometimes that's even better. So that alone would be, pretty much, I think, a B. Well, maybe not a B. That's generous. Probably a B minus. Just because, the stats alone. And then how good is this ability where you're getting an oil counter? So oil counters are going to show up throughout this whole set, and they're just a token that they're a counter that you can exchange for some ability on the card. And notably, you use up the oil counters, but you can get more of them through Proliferate. So Proliferate, we're going to see in just a minute. But Proliferate, what it does is you can add a counter to any permanent and or players of a type it already had. So, Toxic is going to give players poison counters, so Proliferate can build onto players that way. But it also is going to key into these oil counters. So Char Forger, once it gets an oil counter, you can proliferate onto it, but it also fuels itself. So another creature artifact you control from anywhere, you're getting the first one from it, the 1/1. So you're going to get oil counters on it anytime something dies, and then remove 3 of them to be able to exile your top card of your library and play that card this turn. Oh, also, proliferate onto planeswalkers definitely is going to come up in this set because there's a lot of planeswalkers, much more than usual. So basically, Char Forger, I think the ability is good to be able to get the oil counters and play an extra card. I think it's going to be a little bit worse than it reads because you do kind of need to get the engine started on it, and then have 3 things die before trading this one off. However, I see 2 scenarios for this. There's the one where you play the Char Forger, it stabilizes the board basically, or you're attacking with it, and then it kind of just trades off, and you're up maybe like a 1/1, or you got your value because of the creature sizing, and that's great. It's great in the developing stages for that reason. Then I can kind of imagine a different game where like the board has stalled out a little bit, or you're sort of in that mid game, and Char Forger kind of is just sitting as like an enchantment, and all your other creatures, you're trading with them, you're trading your artifacts, you're using your skull bombs, which are artifacts that you sacrifice, and then you just start building up the counters on this thing, and maybe you'll get 2 or 3 cards out of it over the course of the game. Both those scenarios are really, really good. So I think, on rate alone, I'd probably call this card a B minus. But again, I mean, it's kind of boring here, but B for boring. I think Char Forger just gets a B. I don't think it's quite in the B plus range. I could be wrong on that, but it's like not necessarily going to change the game all on its own, I don't think. But I do like that 2/3 stat line because blocking, I think, is really important in the set because of Toxic, which we'll get to in just a minute. All right, quick check in here. We have a question: how much Goblin synergy is in this set? Let's see. Not about goblins here, and then anything else. All right, moving on. Great. Okay, our next card in our gold uncommons is Cinder Slash Ravager. So Cinder Slash Ravager is 4 red and a green for a 5/5 Phyrexian Warrior at uncommon. So 6 mana, 5/5. Not great stats, especially not for a gold uncommon, but clearly there's going to be something more to this card. So what else do we get? Well, it says this spell costs 1 less to cast for each permanent you control with oil counters on it. So not how many oil counters you have, but how many permanents you happen to have with oil counters. Well, we just saw a card with oil counters, and there's a lot of creatures and artifacts that come into play with oil counters. So I think oftentimes the Cinder Slash Ravager, it's going to be a 5 mana 5/5. But sometimes you're going to have 2 or 3 oil creatures or permanents with oil counters on them, and then you're going to get like a 3 or 4 mana 5/5. This card also has Vigilance, so that's huge. So a 5 mana 5/5 Vigilance, or even cheaper than that, that's already a decent deal. And then it says when Cinder Slash Ravager enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. I find that line of text, we've seen it a lot on various cards. It oftentimes, you're going to smash your 3/3 into their 4/4, and then you deal 1 to your opponent's entire team. Getting to trade up and then having a 5/5 Vigilance in play is actually really, really powerful. And I don't think it's going to be that hard to set up. Now, it is the signpost uncommon, so people are going to be on the lookout for this trick, but it's that's kind of hard to play around, right? Like, you just have to block. Not to mention, 1 damage sweeps all the 1/1 Toxic 1 Might tokens running around in the set. And also there's some other small creatures that, have high power, low toughness, and your opponent's trying to like poison you to death. So I think Cinder Slash Ravager is actually going to be quite excellent. I think really its grade is going to be dependent on how quickly you can ramp it out with these oil counters. Like if you go 2-drop with an oil counter, 3-drop oil counter into 4 mana Cinder Slash Ravager, that is a giant beating. I don't think that's going to be that common. Not to mention, to set up those lines I had talked about beforehand, you want to kind of like go into combat and then play it after. If you ever trade off a creature with the oil counter on it, suddenly the Cinder Slash Ravager gets more expensive. So like if it was always going to just be like a 4 mana 5/5 Vigilance that dealt 1 to everything, that would be like a B plus. But I think it's not quite at that level. So probably going to give this one another boring B, but I do think this card is quite good for all those reasons. If the 1/1s end up mattering a lot more in this set, I could see this card going up to a B plus. And also it depends on like how easy it is to get all the oil counters on it. Just as a side note, the way I kind of prepared this whole, podcast presentation was I looked through the previews the last 2 to 3 days every single day and really thought about the cards, and I put these slides together if you're watching the visual version. But I don't have the set memorized, so I have a sense of like what matters, what cards are there, but I don't have like every single card memorized because obviously this set just got previewed. So for things like that where we want to know like how many of a type or how many of something it is that enables something, we're going to have to see with time and evaluate it from then. All right, going to our next signpost uncommon. We have the Necrogen Rot Priest. 2 black-green for a 1/5 Phyrexian Zombie Cleric, an uncommon. So the black-green gold uncommon, what do we get? Well, it has Toxic 2. So this is the first instance of Toxic, so I'll read it. Players dealt combat damage by this creature also get 2 poison counters. So the Toxic comes with a number. So this one, if it deals combat damage to your opponent, they get 2 poison counters. There's Toxic 1, 2, 3. There's even a Toxic 6 creature we're going to see later. And so 1/5 Toxic 2, not really that impressive because how are you going to go to 1/5 through to your opponent? But there's more. It says whenever a creature you control with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player gets an additional poison counter. And you can pay 1 black and green to have target creature you control with Toxic gain Death Touch until end of turn. So if this ever hits your opponent, it's actually kind of functioning like a Toxic 3 because they get that extra Toxic poison counter. And yes, 1/5 doesn't brawl and hit through very well, but you can give this you can give it Death Touch with its ability. So your opponent still has to respect it. And the thing about a 1 power Death Touch creature is your opponent can kind of double or triple block pretty easily, and then yes, you get their best creature that they blocked with, but then it ends up just being a trade. So things I would be looking at for this card is ways to break up double and triple blocks with it. So like cheap interaction, or if you can get green pump spells, then suddenly this plus Death Touch is going to allow you to just wipe everything that they block with. And if they don't do that, then you can just get through in your Toxicking 3 pretty quickly. Not to mention any other toxic creatures you have, you can give those Death Touch as well. So this can kind of sit back, and as I was mentioning before, like sort of in the developing stages of the game, you just have this 1/5, hard to attack through, and then it can kind of sit there as just almost like an enchantment or roadblock, and you can just pump up all your other toxic creatures. I do also want to do a quick call out. So the fact that this has Toxic 2 and it gives a third counter, there's going to be a set of cards that have the ability Corrupted. And what Corrupted does, it gives some bonus when your opponent has 3 poison counters, 3 or more. So the fact that this Necrogen Rot Priest immediately gives your opponent 3 poison counters, they're going to always have to respect that. And so they're going to really want to get this card off of the battlefield. That being said, this card's pretty expensive, pretty clunky. I think of the uncommons we've seen, it kind of requires a little bit more from you. So I don't really know if it quite meets the grade. I kind of think this is like more of a B- rather than a B. It's expensive, but it is powerful. Like the fact that it can give any of your other toxic creatures Death Touch is really what's going on there. So I would give this one a B-. And it can kind of go up or down according to how important it is as a blocker, these types of things. Also, a good note, and this is why I have Twitch chat helping me out. Okay, so for those who haven't been playing for a while, poison counters, what are they? If you get 10 or more poison counters, you lose the game. So basically, you can almost think of giving poison counters as dealing double that damage, and it's something that you can't heal. So when this creature it gives 3 poison counters, it's kind of like dealing them 6 damage. And yeah, so that's Necrogen Rot Priest. Next up, we have the Serum Core Chimera. It's 2 blue and a red for a 2/4 Phyrexia Chimera at uncommon. It has flying, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Serum Core Chimera. So there's those oil counters again. We could proliferate them, but what do we get for those oil counters? Well, it says remove 3 oil counters from Serum Core Chimera. Draw a card. I like that. Then you may discard a non-land card. When you discard a card this way, Serum Core Chimera deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Activate only as a sorcery. So notably, you can't discard a land. It would be great if you could discard a land and get that 3 damage. But this is the type of card that can really snowball, and in the meanwhile, like a 4-mana 2/4 flying body is just pretty good. If you can ever cast your 3 non-creature spells, you get your 3 oil counters, cash it in for a card. You have something bad, then you can, kill something with that 3 damage. This card seems really strong, and it's really good with proliferate, right? Because if you play a non-creature spell and then you play, like, let's say another non-creature spell that happens to proliferate, you're suddenly already at those 3 oil counters. So this card seems excellent to me. And it's just a little on the expensive side to set up because you want to play this first and then your non-creatures. So like if you wanted to play something, like if we look at Bro as an example, if your opponent and you are developing and you played an Excavation Explosion, well, that's 3 mana. Oftentimes you want to play your cards to answer your opponent's cards in the developing stages if they have something that's going to start snowballing. You really don't want to play that type of effect before getting your Serum Core Chimera down. As part of the reason Third Path Iconoclast was so good in Brothers War, because it was 2 mana that cared about non-creatures. So you'd play that early, you'd start chaining off from there, and it'd be wonderful. So Serum Core Chimera, I think it does take quite a bit more to get going. And for that reason, I think it does read a little better than it actually will be, but it does read quite strong. I think the stats are there, I think the ability's there. I think all in all, I'm going to give it a B. It almost reads a little better than a B to me, but I think I got to temper my expectations that it takes a while to get going before you start drawing cards and truly going off. So it's going to take a little bit of work. Notably, also, you want to put this type of card in a deck that's going to have a lot more non-creatures. If you just play a normal, like, 14, 15, 16 creature deck and put Serum Core Chimera in, I think you're going to be pretty disappointed unless the few non-creature spells you play have a lot of ways to proliferate from there. You could make it work that way too, but I think it's going to be a lot less good. All right. Next up, moving right along, these are some fun cards. We got, well, I guess fun in the Phyrexian sense of it. We got Slaughter Singer, really fun here. Green, white for a 2/2. So 2 mana 2/2. Our Phyrexian Cleric at uncommon. And it has Toxic too. And whenever another creature you control with Toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So how good is it to have a 2/2 with Toxic too? Well, your opponent really is incentivized to block it because they don't want to just build up those poison counters. The fact that this doesn't pump itself is definitely makes it a lot worse because this basically just trades with everything. I mean, there's a million, 2 mana 2/2s. Once your opponent gets a 2/3, this doesn't attack very well. That being said, it turns all of your 1/1 Toxic 1 Might tokens into 2/2s when they attack, which is pretty huge. I think 2/3 is going to be a pretty important stat line in this set because there's a lot of these like 2-power toxic creatures that are trying to punch through. And so if that ends up being true, Slaughter Singer is going to help some of your other creatures attack through those roadblocks. But you really, really want to get on the board early because if your opponent plays a Slaughter Singer and you don't have a play to stop it, suddenly you're just already in the 2 poison counter range, and it's already starting to get a little bit dangerous from there. Again, those poison counters aren't going to go away, and if your opponent is able to get you to that toxic, or to get 3 poison counters, you're going to start being corrupted as well, and all their cards are going to get better for those of them that care about it. So 2 mana 2/2. I think as these gold uncommons go, this is on the lower end for me. It is a Lord, which is nice, but you really want to have a lot of other toxic creatures for this to be good, and you want to have, like, you kind of want to be able to go wide, and at that point, like, it's a question of whether you're actually killing with poison counters or dealing damage, because this doesn't increase the number, like the amount of toxic, it just helps those creatures get through and deal damage. So it might be the fact that you played this Slaughter Singer, you're attacking, giving all your toxic creatures +1/+1. Your opponent might just die to damage before they even die to poison counters, which is great too. But when I look at this card, I sort of envision this magical Christmas land where all my creatures have toxic. And I don't think that's necessarily a reality. I think some of them will, and you're going to try to really build around it. I think if literally all your creatures have toxic in your deck, this card's going to be like an A-. But I don't think that's going to be most decks, like all of them having toxic. So I'll probably just, again, I think a lot of them do have toxic. I was going to give this a B-, but the effect is pretty powerful. Again, you're probably building around it. I'm going to give it like a B+ with a star, because I think it is more of a build around. If you don't have much of the toxic ability, this card's like pretty bad. You don't even really want it. But there is a ton of toxic in green and white, so I think that's going to be just fine. All right, let's see, quick check-in. All right, our next one. Okay, Tainted Observer. 1 green-blue for a 2/3 Phyrexian bird at uncommon. Our green-blue signpost uncommon has flying. Toxic 1, so again, that toxic is just floating around a bunch of these places. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 2. If you do, proliferate. Pretty powerful card, right? A 2/3 flyer for 3 mana is already good stats. We saw that in Dominator United. The common is just a 2/3 flying drake for 3 mana. That card was, kind of like a C-, maybe like bordering on D+. But it was like already pretty playable. This has toxic as a bonus already. And then whenever another creature enters the battlefield, being able to pay 2 to proliferate, it's kind of interesting because that's really, really powerful. But if you're curving out, you kind of want to play like your 2-drop, then your Tainted Observer on 3. Suddenly you've like already cast your 2-drop. So to be able to proliferate, this card is good in the developing stages of the game because it's a 2/3 flyer for 3. But I don't think you're going to make much use of the proliferate. So again, this is kind of like a split card based on the board state, where like you played early, you're chipping in for that 2, you're toxicking your opponent, they're getting a poison counter here and there. Anytime you get through with the creature, your opponent has to respect it because this flyer going unchecked is just gonna kind of take over the game. Eventually, you're gonna be able to proliferate, and if your opponent already has like 5 or 6 poison counters, you can just let this sit back, and every single time you play a creature, you're gonna proliferate, everywhere, and you maybe don't even have to attack anymore at that point. Um, that being said, like, it just seems pretty, like, the curve out potential seems like pretty medium for this card. It is still kind of a good top deck because it's always going to be relevant. But I don't know like how brutal it is having like a 2/3 flyer for 3. But it does require your opponent to answer it. Like at some point in the game, they have to remove this card. Like they can't just let it sit there. And so I think this being like a way to impact the board early and being a great top deck later to continue to proliferate does actually make it pretty nice. Like I was thinking, based on the stats alone, it's kind of like a C plus. But the inevitability, I think, bumps it like 2 notches up for me. I probably would again just give this kind of like a B. Like all these cards seem kind of in the same power level for me, where they have sort of this developing stage of the game, and then they have a lot of late game potential. A lot of the build arounds are kind of like that. All right, we have some nice on topic comments here, where getting on board seems incredibly important. I absolutely agree, because if you're not on board early in this set, you're just gonna accrue some poison counters, and then suddenly your opponent's proliferate just takes off. So if you can stop getting the first poison counter, any of that early proliferate just doesn't work. And then, as we're going to see later on, if there happens to be any of the creatures that have corrupted, if you can keep your opponent off of those bonus abilities, that's going to be pretty good too. So I think it's going to be kind of like Brothers War, where like you have to affect the board early, not even because you want to be giving your opponent like those early poison counters. You definitely do want to be doing that. But if you're not getting on board early, your opponent's going to be doing that, and you're just going to be run over, and everything snowballs. So I think it's going to be kind of similar. Like you're getting on board, you're trying to build up, and then you're going to have some sort of over the top game plan later on there. All right, B for Tainted Observer. Our next gold uncommon is Vivisection Evangelist. It's the 3 white black for a 4/4 Phyrexian Cleric. It has Vigilance and Corrupted. All right, so Corrupted, again, it's only if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So it says, when Vivisection Evangelist enters the battlefield, if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, destroy target creature, planeswalker, an opponent controls. So this one's really interesting because the Corrupted is attached to kind of a higher end card. Like it being 5 mana means it's not coming down until later in the game. And so by that point, you sort of built your game plan to be able to give your opponent those 3 poison counters. All it takes is like a hit from like a toxic 2 creature, and then you probably didn't proliferate onto them in black-white, but you have time to get them those 3 poison counters. And so how good is a 5 mana 4/4 that comes in and kills a creature? I mean, that is like ridiculously incredible. It's like, Ravenous Chupacabra plus, but it does require setup. And this card is not always a 5 mana 4/4 Vigilance that destroys a creature. I don't think it's going to be that hard to do though, because there are ways to create, these might tokens that have 1/1 toxic. You can maybe go wide enough to try to push through. It's worth chump attacking a creature to be able to give your opponent that 3rd poison counter for the Vivisection Evangelist. And that's going to be scenarios where it's not easy to give your opponent those 3 poison counters. So this card just seems like incredible to me. I think, assuming that you'll be able to build a deck that gives your opponent 3 poison counters, I think this card's just a B plus. Like, if this card was always on, it would be A-A. And so I'm gonna account for having to give them the 3 counters like before it turns on, but really, really good card. So I'm gonna be taking Vivisection Evangelist early and often for sure. Okay, our final gold uncommon is Voidwing Hybrid. It's blue and a black for a 2/1 flying toxic 1. Nice stats there. And it says when you proliferate, return Voidwing Hybrid from your graveyard to your hand. This card is really, really nice because it's aggressive. Your opponent, it's really hard for your opponent to deal with it, right? Because if it just keeps coming back, you're going to, like, your opponent, if they have a 2/2 flyer, they really don't want to trade with a Voidwing Hybrid. So then they take the damage, they get poison countered. You're setting up, your proliferate engines later on to proliferate onto them. And then when it does, eventually die, then you're able to proliferate it back. Not to mention, if you want to play defense with this card, it's pretty easy to do so, right? You just play a 2-mana 2/1 flyer, and then eventually you proliferate, and then it comes back, and then you can get the, ball rolling from there. So, again, this card seems really, really strong, for 2 mana. You do kind of want to have the proliferate stuff going on, but that's what blue and black are all about. I don't think it's quite as good as the last uncommon that we saw, which is literally coming in and killing things. You do have to invest mana for this to come back down, but having a repeatable creature that can trade off and is a threat itself seems really good. Now there are, like, a decent number of flyers that could stop this thing. If your opponent ever gets a 2/3 flyer or 1/3 flyer or whatever, or bigger, then your Voidwing Hybrid's not really doing that much. But the fact that it can play defense and offense, I'm sort of torn between, like, the B and B plus territory. Now, I don't think it's quite a B plus because it doesn't actually, like, get things out of play automatically or anything like that. It doesn't automatically just give your opponent a ton of poison counters, but it's not that far off. So it's kind of almost between those. If I had, like, a B and a half plus, I would give it that, but that doesn't exist. So I'm just going to give it a B. I'm going to round down. I don't think it's quite in the B plus territory, but this card is very, very good. I think you should pick Voidwing Hybrid often. Okay, so those are our signpost uncommons. All of them seem quite strong, and sometimes, there's some that miss on themes, but these ones are, like, pretty direct. It's like you care about giving your opponent poison counters, you care about, pumping up your team, you care about playing non-creatures and getting oil counters. So all of them, it's, like, pretty straightforward. And so when the golden commons tend to be more on that straight, forward front, I tend to give them a little bit more weight and credit that way. Okay, so let's jump into the full list here. We're going to start with white and our commons and uncommons. Okay. So our first card is Against All Odds. It's 3 and a white for an uncommon sorcery. And it says choose one or both. Exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. And or return target artifact or creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So we did just see Recommission. That's a cheap way to get something back into play and continue pressing your advantage or blocking, attacking, whatever. So half of this card already brings back that mana value 3 or less. Now, Recommission did come with a counter, but it didn't give you multiple bonuses. Against All Odds allows you to flicker something and then bring it back. How much is that worth? Well, it depends on how good your enter the battlefield effects are and how good your 3 mana value or less cards are. For Against All Odds to be good, you really have to be using both halves of this card, because for 4 mana at sorcery speed, you're not able to save a creature from removal. You're not able to ambush anything at instant speed. So it being sorcery, like, makes this card a lot worse than if it were an instant. And paying 4 mana to do either half of this ability is incredibly overcosted. If I'm paying 4 mana to return something and that's all I'm doing, not a very good card. If I'm paying 4 mana to flicker something, also really terrible. So you want to have both for this one. Or if your opponent has, like, a lot of enchantment based removal, great comment there in the chat, then it could free up your creature from that with the flickering. And there is some of that. There's, like, a 1 blue tap down enchantment based aura that basically removal spell in this set. So it could work, but this card I think is pretty bad. I think it's really hard to set up. So I would give this, like, a D plus. Like, you could play this card, but it's something I don't think you want to include. if for some reason like you have the perfect deck for this, you probably can get it into like C plus range, but it's going to require a lot of work from you. So I don't love this card. It also has sideboard applications, but it's not quite a sideboard card in my opinion. Okay, our next up, we have Annex Sentry. 2 and a white for a 1/4 artifact creature. It's a Phyrexian cleric at uncommon. It has Toxic 1. And when Annex Sentry enters the battlefield, exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less until Annex Sentry leaves the battlefield. So we've seen cards like this where, it just comes in, removes their card temporarily. It doesn't technically get rid of it forever, but a 3 mana 1/4 is pretty large for this effect. It's going to be kind of hard for your opponent to get rid of that 4th toughness, I would say. Like, for example, there's a 3 damage burn spell in this set. So having 4 toughness, pretty nice on this card. But it can only hit something with mana value 3 or less. So it's not like you're answering their big bombs, even temporarily, with the Annex Sentry. However, I think this type of card is even better in this type of set, where you're trying to get those initial attacks through to toxic your opponent. Like if you played a 2-drop with toxic, then your opponent plays, a 2-drop or a 3-drop if they were on the play. You play your Annex Sentry, you remove their, 3-drop, and then you attack with your toxic creature, giving them a poison counter, and now you have a 1/4 to block with. That sequence seems very, very common to me and incredibly powerful. So I think this card is just super good. And, there's basically always going to be targets, especially because this set you want to get on board early is my impression. And that's kind of what it seems like with Toxic running around everywhere. So you're always going to find targets for your opponent. Not to mention there's some artifact synergies and other things with this card too. If it could hit anything, I would probably give this card like... it'd almost be in the A- range, but not quite. I think the fact that it's limited to 3 or less sort of leaves this for me at a B. I think it's really, really good. If it could hit anything, it'd be more like a B plus A-, but it's not in that range. But I think this is on par with the power level with some of those gold uncommons we've seen, aka really, really strong. So Annex Sentry, again, probably going to be a first pick out of some packs. So be on the lookout for that one. Next up, we have Apostle of Invasion. So Apostle of Invasion is 4 white for a 4/4 Phyrexian Angel and uncommon. So 6 mana 4/4 flyer. Decent start. Not really that impressed with those stats. We've seen 6 mana 4/4 flyers before, and unless they have really good abilities, they tend to fall flat and be sort of in that D range just because they're so expensive. And in modern day limited, you pay 6 mana, your opponent answers it. It's like a terrible deal for you. But there's more. It's not a 6 mana 4/4 flyer. It has Corrupted. So as long as your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, Apostle of Invasion has Double Strike. That's a pretty big payoff, because often the problem with these 4/4 flyers, when they come down and you spend all that mana, is they don't stabilize the board. So if your opponent already is corrupted and they have 3 or more poison counters, you having that first strike on that 4 power when it comes down is mostly going to, stop your opponent from attacking you in combat. Like, they have to have a combat trick to go over it, and then even then they're probably getting 2 for 1 because of the double strike. Or they need the removal spell, which can just kill this to then attack through. Whereas if it was just a 4/4 and your opponent, can keep attacking, and it's just you're going to trade 1 for 1 if you had to block, that's pretty bad. So normally these 4/4 flyers are bad in terms of the fact that they don't stabilize the board, and then you fall behind because they're very mana inefficient. However, the upside of a 4/4 flyer is they end the game very quickly. So this card has the upside of actually blocking well, assuming you're corrupting your opponents. And then on top of it, you're attacking through, and it's basically attacking for 8 on its own with double strike. So it kind of reads like similar cards we've seen before. However, I think assuming that you build your deck in a way to get corrupted, this card's going to be quite a bit better than those 4/4 flyers for 6 mana that we've seen in the past. That being said, there's setup, right? Like, if you don't build your deck in a way to get your opponent the poison counters, which I think is kind of hard to do in this set because there is so many ways to toxic and give your opponent poison counters. Assuming you do that and you build with it in mind, I think this card is more like a C+. I think like you're going to be happy with it, and I think it's going to do what it says, and it's going to be pretty good. If you basically don't have corrupted frequently, this card's like a D. And if you like always had it, it's almost like a B minus. So that's why I think it's kind of like in that C plus range. And it functions as like a board stabilizer slash finisher. And you don't want to load up on 6 mana cards, but taking this card like 5th through 9th pick, somewhere in there, is probably going to be pretty reasonable. Alrighty. Next up, this is a card I referenced earlier. It's Basilica Shepherd. So it's 3 white for a 3/3 flying Phyrexian Angel at common. So we actually have a common here. So for 5 mana, you get a 3/3 flyer, but there's more. It says, when Basilica Shepherd enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So again, Toxic 1 gives a poison counter when it deals damage. Just want to say that another time. This is a theme. We're going to see these 1/1 Might artifact creature tokens. And so getting a 1/1 that can't block, it kind of reminds me of the decay tokens again from Midnight Hunt, which I kind of keep coming back to over and over with sets. It's like these pieces of cardboard that you can use to push your game plan, do different things with. But we look at this one specifically, and so these 1/1s, I think they're going to be a little bit worse than they look because a lot of a 1/1's value is being able to block your opponent. And so if your opponent had like a 3/1 and you play this 3/3, technically you get 2 1/1s, but your 3/3 doesn't block the 3/1 well, and the 1/1s can't block. So I don't get overly excited about the 1/1s, but they do kind of make it harder for your opponent to attack you, because if they attack you, you can attack back with some of these 1/1s and go wide. So I think there is going to be a little bit of that tension, but they read a little bit better than I think they're actually going to perform, unless your plan is to go wide enough with Toxic that you don't care about, losing those 1/1s. And so in that way, it's kind of like a repeatable decayed token effect. What's interesting is that if you have a mix of toxic and non-toxic, your opponent's going to get into these spots where they can choose to either block your creatures that just deal normal combat damage, like this Basilica Shepherd itself, or they might be forced to make some suboptimal blocks just so they don't take poison counters and block some of these 1/1 tokens that you kind of care about, but not really. You're using them to kind of push through damage, push through your last points of poison or actual damage itself. And so for that, I think the Basilica Shepherd actually does quite a bit, and it has some combos. Like adding 3 bodies, even if the 1/1s aren't even that impressive at that point in the game, does quite a bit. Now, historically, these 5 mana 3/3 flyers, they need to have a pretty big board impact for them to actually be good. We've seen a lot of instances like 5 mana 3/3 flyers that gain you some life or give you some subtle advantage. Those cards tend to pretty much underperform. Like again, those are kind of like D pluses. But we've actually seen some good ones before too. Like for example, I think of Dawn Feather Eagle, which is a 5 mana 3/3 flyer that gives all your creatures +1/+1 and vigilance until end of turn. I think this card's probably closer to the Dawn Feather Eagle side, as long as you can make use of the toxic tokens. I think if you're just playing it and like you're not really all in on that toxic game plan, which again kind of seems hard to do in the set, and like it's kind of baked into every color, then like if this card's just a random card in your deck, it's not going to be very good. But if it's synergistic in your deck and you're able to go wide with it and do all that, I think this card's actually going to be quite nice. I think at the end of the day, I think it's kind of just a C. I think you can't overload on like these 5 mana plays. And so I wouldn't pick this card like super aggressively, but I do think it's going to contribute meaningfully to your game plan. And again, it's just a lot of pieces of cardboard for its cost. So all in all, I kind of like the Basilica Shepherd. All right, next white card, we have Bladed Ambassador. 1 and a white for a 3/1 Phyrexian Soldier at uncommon. And it says Bladed Ambassador enters the battlefield with a Noel counter on it. And you can pay 1, remove a Noel counter from Bladed Ambassador. Bladed Ambassador gains indestructible until end of turn. So here we see that instance of oil counters again. This one comes spotted, spots you with the first one for free, which is pretty nice. I mentioned, proliferate being in the set. If you can ever proliferate onto this, then you can kind of freely remove a counter to give this indestructible. But we're kind of used to seeing like 2 mana 3/1 creatures. But this being able to get indestructible really represents threat of activation. Because if you play this and then your opponent has like a 2/2 or whatever, do they really want to block? You just get to eat their creature and indestructible yours, and you still have a 3/1 lying around. So I almost want to think of this like there was the I'm forgetting the name of it, but from Brothers War, the 3/1 artifact for 2 mana, and it had Unearth. Well, your opponent didn't really want to trade with that card because it would just come back later and deal some more damage. This card has kind of similar threat of activation where it's like your opponent really doesn't want to put something in front of it early. And so that means you're just attacking for 3 a bunch of times. Oh, and I think the card was Astronaut's Harvester, if I'm thinking correctly. And so Bladed Ambassador, I'm pretty impressed with it. It also blocks pretty well, right? 2 mana, 3 power creature. It can kind of stabilize the ground. Your opponent can't attack with their 3/3 because you can also, again, just block an indestructible. And it also attacks really well. It's interesting because it doesn't play into that toxic space where it, if you care about poison counters, this card's not really doing a lot for you. But if you care about just high power damage, I think Blade Ambassador is going to be a card you're really, really happy with. So, I don't know which way to go with this card. It just looks really annoying the way it reads. Now, you do have to pay a mana to remove the counter and give it indestructible. I think that mana is huge. If it was free, this card would be kind of busted. But it's like, that will interrupt your curve. So if your opponent ends up just like biting the bullet and blocking, it's going to be hard for you sometimes to be able to use the ability and continue to develop your board. Sometimes it'll take your whole turn. So that is to take into account. I'm sort of leaning between like the C+ and B- territory with this. I think at the end of the day, this is just a really good, efficient card, but it's not like broken. I think it's a C+ that you can kind of make be better. Like if you have a lot of proliferate and you can do it on the cheap, then being able to indestructible this multiple times probably gets it into the B range. But as is, just the card as written is probably like a C+. It's a card you're always going to be happy with, and it's going to serve some functions, but it's not particularly synergistic with anything that we've seen so far. Alrighty, moving right along here. We have Charge of the Mites. It's 2 and a white for a common instant, and it says choose one. Charge of the Mites deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker, or create 2 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Mite artifact creature tokens with toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So I kind of talked about the caveats with the Mites. This being an instant is nice because you can surprise some creatures to then attack. However, we've seen this type of effect before, and a lot of this effect's value is getting the 1/1s that can block, and even then, the 3 mana put 2 1/1s into play has often underperformed. Like, it looks kind of nice in terms of going wide, but if those 1/1 bodies don't matter that much, or your opponent has like any blocks at all, like your opponent has like a 1/2, suddenly this card is like pretty embarrassing. So the ambush side of this, putting the 2 1/1s into play, them not being able to block, it can surprise your opponents, but I'm not really that impressed. However, this card does do a bit more and gives some nice flexibility because it also, if you have 3 creatures in play and you can deal 3 damage to target creature, that could be pretty good, right? Like having a white removal spell that encourages you going wide is nice, and the modality on this card is good in different situations. If you already have a lot of creatures in play, this can act as a removal spell to clear your opponent's blockers and allow you to attack through. If you don't have a lot of creatures in play, you can make the 1/1s and then continue to attack your opponent from there. The problem I see with this is that while those are different scenarios, you don't have a lot of creatures in play and you're making 2 1/1s that can't block really doesn't help you that much, right? Like, because your board presence is pretty bad in that scenario. And then the 1/1s, they might matter, but like they don't help you really that much get on board. So I'm kind of evaluating this card as like when you're at parity or already ahead, it's pretty decent. If you're behind it all, it's like not very good, and it's a little mana inefficient. Like, we had Patriarch's Humiliation, which was like one of the best removal spells we've seen in recent memory, but it costs a single white mana to deal damage based on the number of creatures you control, and it was so good because it was mana efficient. Paying 3 for that, it excites me a lot less. So while this card has flexibility, I don't think either half is like that strong. I'm gonna go C- on this card, but I'm even kind of dubious at that. This card might just be in the D range. But I do have to acknowledge that modality on this card is pretty nice. All right, our next one, I think this one's pretty nice too, is Complete Devotion. It's 1 and a white for a common instant, and it says target creature you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If that creature has Toxic, draw a card. So if we think about this, combat tricks, what do you expect? Like, what are you hoping to get out of your combat trick? Well, you're trying to win a combat, but there's some downsides to combat tricks, right? One of the downsides of the combat tricks is you're trading tempo, like you're going tempo negative oftentimes to be able to go over the top of your opponent's creature. And at the end of the day, it's just a 1-for-1. So, your opponent blocks their 3/3 on your 2/2, and you use a combat trick, and if that's your entire turn, like casting your combat trick really cost you because you can't continue to develop your board. Your opponent untaps, they play something else, and you didn't really get that far with it. In addition, the problem is that when you just trade 1-for-1, it kind of like you fall behind eventually unless you're going wide enough. But this card actually helps on that 1-for-1 front because while you might sometimes be going tempo negative, you get that card back, so you're actually pulling ahead, right? Because this card replaces itself. I think if you don't have a lot of toxic creatures, Complete Devotion, 2 mana +2/+2, way too mana inefficient, not a good card. But +2/+2 draw a card for 2 mana is pretty nice. So yeah, we've seen those combat tricks where they draw you a card and they function as 2-for-1s to be quite good. Oftentimes they cost 3 mana. We've seen things like Moment of Defiance, Suit Up, the Blessed Metamorphosis or whatever it was from Streets of New Capenna. Like all those cards have overperformed, and this card can kind of function like that on 2 mana. I can't do it every single time, but if it does it often enough and you have enough toxic creatures, this card is going to be quite good. Also, it existing when your opponent's playing white, you really have to look out for it. Like, because again, not every single creature is going to have toxic. So you can kind of think about whether or not when they're attacking, are they attacking with just their toxic creatures because that's really what they want to target? Or if they're attacking with everything and you think they might have this card, you're much more incentivized to block the non-toxic creature, but you're going to be taking some combat. You're going to be taking some poison counters for that, which, really benefits the person playing Complete Devotion. If they want to just get you some poison counters, your opponent doesn't want to block, then you're closer to corrupting your opponent with the 3 poison counters. So I think overall this card is just like quite a strong card. And in addition, yes, your opponent is incentivized to block toxic because who wants poison counters? I certainly don't want poison counters. So I'm going to be blocking my opponent's creatures, and then this is going to 2-for-1 me, and I'm going to feel really bad because this card's quite good. So I think this card's just like a C+. I think it's just going to you can't overload on combat tricks, but if you have enough toxic creatures, I think you could play like 2 or 3 of this card because it's pretty mana efficient. It costing 2 instead of 3, I think is a huge deal. And this card's going to be more in the B range. Like if all your creatures are toxic, this card's just going to be incredible because your opponent has to block you, and then you're just going to get 2-for-1s off of it. So I think this card's like a really, really strong common, almost in the B range. But I think at the end of the day, it's a combat trick, so I need to temper that a little bit. Like I'm hyped for it, as you can tell. But C+, we'll leave it at that. Alrighty, here it is, our 1 mana 1/1, right? We've really changed our evaluations on 1 mana 1/1s over the years. They used to be bad, but now they're quite good. So what do we get here? The card is Crawling Chorus. It's a single white mana for a 1/1 Phyrexian Horror at common. It has Toxic 1, so a 1 mana 1/1 Toxic 1. That gets on board pretty quickly. And when it dies, you get one of those 1/1 mites that can't block, that have Toxic 1. So how good is a 1/1 Toxic 1 that dies into a 1/1 Toxic 1? Pretty solid, I think. This card is very, it is that getting on board strategy that we talked about. If you're not planning to get on board on like turn 1 or 2, your opponent is planning to play Crawling Chorus, crawl on over to you, and slap you in the face with a poison counter. So you just have to be really careful with that. And make sure that you're planning around that, because if your opponent goes 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop, and you already have 2 or 3 poison counters, and your first play is on turn 3, it doesn't take a lot for your opponent to just remove your blocker and end the game on the spot. So you really got to be careful of that. And in addition, because this card comes down on turn 1, you're going to be able to give them, those first few poison counters. You're going to turn on Corrupted pretty early. Combos nicely with that white, black, gold uncommon we saw earlier. Turns on your Shriek Maw, rat, your ETB, kill a creature pretty easily. And if there's a lot of X1s in the format, then this being a 1-mana 1/1 that dies into another 1/1 means it attacks well and kind of blocks well early on. I don't think the creature sizing is that way, but we want to really look out for X1s because this is, in a way, X1 hate as well. So I think this card's quite strong. It's a huge enabler for the type of card that you're trying to build. I'm going to go as high as C+ on it. I think this combos so well with the last card we just saw, where like you attack with this, you get them poison counter. Your opponent plays a 2/2, they want to block this card, you attack with it, they block, you completed devotion it, give it +2/+2, you draw a card. Like that is just such a crazy start to a game that I'm gonna go C+ on the Crawling Chorus. I know it's kind of bold to give a 1-drop C+, but I think that is the era we live in now. I'm certainly gonna take this card and put it in a lot of decks until proven wrong. Alrighty, next up. That's a good point. Before we move on, the Crawling Chorus, there's a comment that it works really well with sacrifice cards in black too. So if you're able to get your opponent, those early poison counters, the 1/1 body is no longer good, you sacrifice it, your opponent's corrupted, you've gotten your use out of the Crawling Chorus, you do other things with it. It just does a lot. So a lot for a little. Always nice. All right, Duelist of Deep Faith. 1 and a white for a 2/2 toxic 1 at common, and as long as it's your turn, Duelist of Faith, Deep Faith has first strike. So a 2/2 first strike on your turn, and 2/2 on your opponent's turn. This kind of card kind of gives me nightmares. Like I have PTSD from original Zendikar when I read cards like this. It's kind of why I was mentioning before, I think 2/3s in this set are going to be kind of important, because there's a lot of rounded stats with the toxic creatures. Like we just saw a 1/1 for 1. We have a 2/2 for 2. I think if you can break up those rounded stat creatures that, square stat creatures, then like the 2/3 stat line is pretty nice, especially against these white decks with these early toxic creatures. So this card obviously rumbles really well in the early game. It's also insanely good with the pump spell we saw earlier. So 2 mana, 2/2 first strike when you're attacking. Also means like you're not trying to block, right? You're trying to be assertive with these toxic decks, which makes a lot of sense. Eventually, a 2/2 first strike does kind of fall off. The main way it falls off, again, is if your opponent just plays something where that 2 power is no longer good enough. But for a common, I mean, that is pretty strong and kind of scary. And so I think at the end of the day, how good this card's going to be is just based on the creature sizing. But if you're able to back this card up with any kind of... if you're able to back this card up with any kind of like pump spell, ways to punch this through, to continue to keep attacking, then just being on board with this and being one of the common plays in white is something that we just have to think about in terms of the format. Like, to me, this type of card existing is kind of format defining, where you just have to build your decks with these creatures in mind. At the end of the day, I kind of think it's just like a C. Like, I think it's a good creature. I wouldn't go crazy for it. But we have to respect it, right? It might, like, if 2/2 body attacking is really, really good, this card might creep up and be like a C+. Based on what I've seen when I look through the set, I don't think that's the case, thankfully. Like, I think we're still going to be able to block, which is why I'm just giving this a C. But we also want to think about how we're building our decks with this kind of card, and you really want to pair it with combat tricks so you can keep attacking with it. All right. Our next card is a pretty nice follow-up to the last couple. This is Flensing Raptor. 2 and a white for a 2/2 Phyrexian bird at common. It has flying and toxic 1. So basically just like they're tacking on toxic to just whatever. Like a 3 mana 2/2 flyer, you wouldn't bat an eye at that. You'd say, okay, Windrake, cool. But we're getting more than that, right? We're getting toxic 1. So we're adding poison counters on top of all this. And when Flensing Raptor enters the battlefield, another target creature you control with toxic gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. So this is kind of what I was saying with the analogy back to Midnight Hunt Decayed tokens. Toxic 1, Toxic 2, or whatever. It's just like they're kind of being thrown out with candy. Like you get Toxic 1, you get Toxic 1. They're kind of everywhere. And so it's kind of why I think if you're building out your boards, you're getting your might tokens, everything having toxic, eventually just go wide enough where your opponent really can't stop it. So anything that has toxic plays well with toxic, and I think you're just gonna want to take these commons and gonna give your opponent poison counters. Not to mention, this card is a 3-mana 2/2 flyer that curves out so well with the 1 and 2 drop we just looked at that like it's kind of the 1-2-3 punch, right? You play your 1-mana toxic 1/1, you hit him, you hit your opponent for 1, give him poison counter. You play your 2/2 first strike on 2. Maybe your opponent plays a 2/2. Okay, well you attack them for 2 the next turn, do something. Then your opponent plays something to block your 2/2. Then you jump it in the air. Suddenly your opponent has 3 counters, and now you have a 2/2 that keeps attacking. So, yeah, I think white is going to be able to enable corrupted pretty easily. Even just with this card here, you can see how you can pretty easily curve out and give your opponent 3 poison counters quickly. And Toxic is just being thrown out like gravy. I think this card's really good. Like the fact that it's an evasive Toxic flyer. I like it more than the 2-drop. But you do want to pair it with those 2-drops and other creatures with cheap Toxic effects. I'm going to give this card a C+. I think just a flying creature that enables your whole game plan is nice. And it gives a direction, right? I often talk when drafting, like when I find a direction, that helps me hone in and I'm like, okay, I know what my deck is doing. Having this card paired with other toxic cards, that is definitely a direction, a very, very strong direction in terms of where you're pointed. All right, our next card gives me a little bit of hope, which is nice. I'm a little worried about all these toxic creatures just giving me poison counters very, very quickly, and that's where I think our next card comes in here. So now our next card is Gold Warden's Helm. It's 2 and a white for a common equipment. And it has 4 Mirrodin. So if you remember, you get a 2/2 that comes into play and it attaches this equipment. And the equipped creature gets +0/+1. So what are we getting here? We're paying 2 and a white for essentially a 2/3. And you can equip this for 1 and a white. So you get a 2/3 right off the bat for 3 mana. I mentioned how I think 2/3 is like a pretty key stat line, especially against the other white decks. So this card's almost like the anti-white card, right? It's good against that 2/2 first strike we looked at. It's good against, the 1/1 toxic one. And getting to move this around and give the +0/+1 really helps against some of these toxic creatures where if they have those square stats, then breaking parity and just having a good blocker and moving this around is pretty nice. I really like pretty much like as long as they're efficiently costed, these living equipments just seem really, really good to me. Because a 2/3 for 3 is not really a good card, but the fact that it leaves something around, something that you can sink some mana into later, and also has some synergies with other equipments is pretty nice. Now, I'm not going to go crazy for this card. I kind of think it's worse than the last few cards we've seen, but it still seems pretty good. Like, I think this card is pretty solid. I'm just going to give it a C. Like, I think it's like a totally respectable card. If the 2/3 ends up not mattering this set, this card's going to get quite a bit worse. So if I'm wrong on that assessment, the only reason I'm giving it a C is because I think that 2/3 stat line is really good. Otherwise, this card's more like a C-, D+. But this something to just keep in mind. Apparently, there's the red shock variant is really good against all these 4 Mirrodin cards. So we'll get to that later as well. Thanks for that comment in chat. +0/+1 exactly. It's good against the mites. It's good against all these toxic cards that we've been seeing, right? Where like, and it makes sense. That's the flavor of the 4 Mirrodin. It's gonna help us block. Although I'm a little confused. Are we on Dominaria or Mirrodin? Does anyone know? Is it just that this is 4 Mirrodin, but we're on Dominaria because now they've come through everywhere? Oh, Mirrodin is Phyrexia now. We're off Dominaria, right? I'm not a lore master. Sorry for the divergence, everyone. When I was reading the set, I was like, why are we talking about Mirrodin? Okay, obviously we're on Mirrodin. There's Darkslick Shores. I get the flavor now. Okay, now that you know that I'm a lore doofus, moving on to our next card. Hex Gold Hoverwings is 3 and a white for an uncommon artifact equipment. It has 4 Mirrodin, because we're on Mirrodin. It's now Phyrexia. So you get a 3 mana 2/2 flying because the equipped creature has flying, and it says creatures you control that are equipped get +1/+0. So for 4 mana, you get a 3/2 flyer, and you can equip for 2 and a white. So how good is a 4 mana 3/2 flyer? Well, it's a Snapping Drake, but being able to equip for 2 and a white, move this around, give something else +1/+0 and flying, it's a little expensive for that equip cost, but the fact that it comes with a 3/2 automatically is really good, right? Like, I'm pretty happy to play defense with this card, and then it turns into a card that jumps something else. Um, I think a reasonable comparison for this card is actually, it's kind of a weird comparison, but it's kind of like Talus Lookout. That was that Dominaria 2 blue blue 3/2 flyer, where that was a pretty aggressive creature, but you were also happy to trade it off because you got your card back. The card you get back in this case is just an equipment that can move and jump things. So, like, I'm pretty happy to like play this and just trade with my opponent's 3/3 or whatever, and then I can just move it to something else and start attacking with it. So actually, when I think of it in that lens, like Talus Lookout was like a pretty good card. Um, as long as this card isn't really easy to answer, and we'll see with the removal if it comes up whether or not this is easy to answer. I don't think this card's like insane, but it does give a lot of material for you to be able to push different plans around. So I think for that, I would probably give this a C plus. Like, I don't think it's like an insane card, but Talus Lookout I was always happy with. This card's probably just a card I'll always be happy with, but nothing like incredible or whatever. Just pretty solid. All right. Incisor Glider. That's a fun name. 1 and a white for a 1/3 artifact creature Phyrexian construct at common. It has flying, and it also has corrupted. So it says whenever Incisor Glider attacks, if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Notably, it also counts itself. This card is interesting because it's a pretty good aggressive card if you can get the corrupted online, but it's also a pretty good early drop to stop your opponent's corrupted stuff. So if your opponent is playing those, 1/1s, 2/2s, 3/1s, whatever, you play this early, and if you're not the one that's beating down, you can just trade it off, or you can hold down their creatures. So it hold down the fort pretty well. When I first read this card, I thought I read it as a 1/1 flyer, and that card would be way worse. The fact that this is a 1/3, like, it's just gonna play multiple roles pretty well. And again, in white, it doesn't seem that hard to get corrupted. And then this attacks as a 2/4 because it counts itself, and it pumps all your other creatures. So for a common, this card's actually doing quite a lot. Now again, you need to build your deck in a way that's corrupting. Like 2 mana 1/3 flyer that doesn't have this bonus is a pretty mediocre card. That's like a D. Excuse me. It just doesn't do that much. Although I am a big fan of Coast Drake. Coast Drake is just a 2 mana 1/3 flyer from a core set. And even that was pretty good. So this does a lot more than that. I don't think this card's like crazy, but I think it does have a lot of utility. I'm gonna give this a C, but I think it's gonna earn its C. Like, you're gonna be happy with this card in your deck, which is kind of exactly what a C is, right? Like, it's a role player. It's gonna serve as its function very well, and it's sort of just bread and butter going to get the job done as what white is looking to do. So yeah, I like the Incisor Glider. So far, white looks really good, right? It's very synergistic with itself, but all the cards do stand on their own. And so for me, that's always something to look out for. We're like, oh, this is very powerful. There's only been a couple clunkers so far. Like, all the permanents seem really strong. All right. Indoctrination Attendant. 3 and a white for a 3/4 Phyrexian Cleric at common. It has Toxic 1, so again, just everything has Toxic. And when Indoctrination Attendant enters the battlefield, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand. If you do, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So, what are the uses for this card? Well, first off, it's a 4 mana 3/4 with Toxic 1. How good is that stat line? It's a little underpowered, right? We tend to think of wanting 2 points of power and toughness in general for every mana cost you pay. So, for example, our last card, we paid 2 mana for a 1/3 flyer. 2 mana times 2 is 4. You kind of think, okay, that's about on par for stats. So this card's a little bit on the lower end for your power and toughness of what you get these days. But how good then is a 3/4 Toxic 1 with that ability? Well, the ability is tempo negative, right? You can bounce your own creature to get a 1/1 Might that can't block. The 1/1 might I'm not that excited about because at that point in the game, unless you're going wide with all of them, it's just not really going to punch through. Your opponent can easily hold back one thing to block the might, and it's not doing that much. 3/4, it attacks okay for Toxic One, but nothing special. So really, for this card to shine, you need combos where you have insane enter the battlefield effects, where it's worth playing this, bouncing the thing, going tempo negative to then get something really strong. I'm thinking like that white black gold uncommon. You got one or two of those. You're gonna be able to bounce it and kill another one of your opponent's creatures. Sign me up all day. That sounds fantastic. But that's kind of the level that you need to be at for this card to be good. The other one, and I was just getting that great comment in the chat, is that if your opponent's playing a lot of aura-based removal, this card shines. Now, I do think there is a decent amount of that aura-based removal, and we've already seen a couple ways to blow out those effects. So it makes me a little bit nervous. That being said, I don't think this card is like an all-star. It's almost more like a role player sideboard card, unless you have the huge payoff. So right now, based on what we've seen, it kind of almost seems like a white-black build-around card. I'm gonna give this a C minus build around. Like, I think if I just looked at this card on the surface, it's kind of just like a D. It's just not that good. But if you have all the synergies and you can sort of build around in a way where it's worth going tempo negative to bounce something, then I think this card actually can do quite a lot. So we're giving it a C minus if you build around it grade, which is kind of a damning grade, but here we are. Now we've got I'm drinking from a Jace water bottle today, so it was cool when they handed out these water bottles at the Pro Tour back in the day. Hopefully they get that swag back for future Pro Tours. All right. Poor Jace, by the way. We'll get to that later. Infested Flesh Cutter is our next white card. It's 1 and a white for an uncommon artifact equipment. And it does not have 4 Mirrodin, so this clears up. Not every single creature is 4 Mirrodin. Some of them are Phyrexian. This is the Phyrexian side. Now, so 1 and a white for an artifact equipment. It says equipped creature gets +2/+0. Whenever equipped creature attacks, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So actually, this is the last time I'm going to read what a Might is. So moving forward, if something makes mites, it has Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So I'm just going to say if it makes a Might, okay? All right, so equipped creature gets +2/+0 when it attacks, makes a Might, and equip 2 and a white. So how good is a 2-mana equipment that costs 3 to equip to give +2/+0 and makes mites when you attack? Incredibly expensive and really costly with your mana. I think if this gave like +2/+1 or some boost to toughness, maybe we could talk about that. But 3 to equip is a lot, right? Like that's almost an entire turn. So I'm pretty off this card. When you're able to finally invest all that mana, you're going to get mites in the late game when they don't matter as much. Now, the one scenario I see for this card is like the board is stable and you play this card, put it on a creature, attack, it trades, you got a mite. Next turn, you equip it either to the mite or another creature, attacks, it trades, you get another mite. But that is really slow and grindy on only certain board states. I think this card's pretty bad. I'm not interested in spending all my mana to invest into this card. There's scenarios where it can be good, but most of those scenarios, like you'd never ever want to play this in the first like 4 turns of the game. Maybe on turn 5 you play it in equip, but I think just having like a 5-drop creature is going to be so much better. Like that angel that comes into play and gives you 2 mites immediately, I'd much rather have that if I'm spending 5 mana on a card. I think this card is just a D. Like I really don't want to play it. It's pretty clunky. Now if it had 4 Mirrodin and came with a creature, now we're talking, but obviously that would be really good. All right. Yeah. So D for Infested Flesh Cutter. Our next one, Jawbone Duelist. We talk about those square stats on toxic creatures. Here we go again. This is 1 and a white for a 1/1 Phyrexian Soldier at uncommon. It has double strike and toxic 1. So kind of attacks as like a 2/1. If you can get this through, then it's giving your opponent 2 poison counters because it's toxicing 1 every time it hits. So a pretty decent attacker there. It can trade with 2/2s early. It's really good with that combat track again because it turns into a 3/3 double striker and you draw a card off of complete. What's the name of that combat trick again? Complete Devotion. Yeah. So that combo of getting Complete Devotion on our 1/1 double strike creature with Toxic is pretty sick. So how good is a 1/1 double strike Toxic 1 for 2 mana? I think it's pretty solid. I think the 1/1 double striking variant that plays with the theme has been like pretty good most of the time. We saw this in Streets of New Capenna, which when you targeted your creature, Illuminator Virtuoso was a 1/1 that double strike, and when you target it, it got to Connive, which helped it grow. This card doesn't have a way that it can grow on its own, but we've seen a lot of ways to pump up our toxic creatures. We saw the green, white, golden common. That's a nasty curve out. If you played this on 2, right, you play your 2 mana 1/1 double strike, you play your green, white, golden common on turn 3, you attack, it gives your Jawbone Duelist +1/+1, suddenly you have a 2/2 double strike toxic 1, and your opponent shakes their head, and they're like, what do I do? We also saw Flensing Raptor, which was the 2 and a white 2/2 flyer with toxic 1 that jumps something. So if you played your Jawbone Duelist and your opponent somehow was able to stop it, you fling it in the air, you attack your opponent for 4 damage and 2 poison counters. Pretty fantastic. I think overall this card's just pretty good. I'm going to give it C+. I think it's solid, and I think you're going to be pretty happy with it. I don't think it's like broken, but it does have a lot of synergies across the set. So C+ for Jawbone Duelist. Cool. Our next common is a Leonin Lightbringer. 2 and a white for a 3/2 Cat Rebel at common, and has Ward 2. And as long as Leonin Lightbringer is equipped, it gets +1/+1. So a 3 mana 3/2 Ward 2 is fine. The thing about the 3/2s is they always attack worse than you think, right? Because your opponent gets the option to trade up with it with like a 2/1. But they're always serviceable, right? So if this was like a 2 mana 3/1 with Ward 2, I'd be much more interested in it. But at 3/2, I think this card's like pretty bad. As long as it's equipped, it gets +1/+1. That is pretty nice. If you have cheap equip costs and you can like block with your 4 Mirrodin equipment thing and then move it onto this, and it gets a bonus. If it has the bonus, this card is basically a 4/3 for 3 with Ward 2. That's pretty good. So really, I think you have to build around it, because I think a 3/2, 3 mana 3/2 Ward 2 is not enough these days. In general, I just think like you need more from your 3/2s. Now, the ability is pretty solid. So I think I'm going to give this like a build around C-. And then let's see. So questions about this card here. Is this better if it were a 3 mana 2/3 Ward 2? I think absolutely, because I think what you need with this card is you need time to set up the equipment. So if this was a 2/3 instead of a 3/2, it kind of holds the fort, and then eventually you pump it up and you'd have like a 3/4 plus the equip ability. I think that card actually would be really, really good. Quite a bit better, I should say. Not really good, but quite a bit better. I'm going to give this a build around C-. I think you don't want to put this card in your deck if you don't have the equipments. But I think if you do have the equipments, this is a card you can play, and eventually it'll be good, like later in the game. You don't want to count on it as being like your 3-drop. What you want to do with this card is you want to have extra 3-drops, so you're not playing this as your 3-drop. And then once you trade off your 4 Mirrodin creature, you play this on turn 5, you move your +0/+1 equipment, and suddenly you have a 4/4 Ward 2 for 5 mana, which is like pretty solid. All right. Our next card. Mandible Justicar. Justicar? Justiciar? Is that how you say Justicar? No, that's different than Justicar. All right, I probably should cut this one out of the podcast recording here, but apologize for you listeners. Okay, Mandible Justiciar is 1 and a white for a 2/1 artifact creature, Phyrexian Cleric at common. We do want to be noting which ones are artifacts and not, because there are a lot of payoffs for like having artifacts, sacrificing artifacts, so we'll keep an eye on that. There have been a few artifacts so far. Notably, all the mites are also artifacts. So, a 2 mana 2/1 artifact creature. It has lifelink, and whenever another artifact enters the battlefield in your control, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Now, I just talked about how I don't love the 3/2 stat line, and also 2/1 trades with literally anything. We've been pretty happy with 2/2 lifelinks for 2 in the past, and this card is similar to that. And as long as your curving out with artifacts, this gets pretty good, but this doesn't count creatures. So if you play this and then play like a 3-drop that's not an artifact, this doesn't get the bonus. And then your opponent just trades with like literally whatever. So in that sense, I'm not like really into this card. I think a lot of the other white commons are a lot better. Notably also Lifelink is a little worse in a set with poison counters, because life is great and, you know, damage is going to matter, but poison is not something that you can heal from. So I think, you know, this card, it has synergies. I think it's going to be fine, but I think it's worse than a 2-power lifelink creature normally is. I think I'm going to give this a C-. Like, it's a perfectly fine card to put in your deck, but I don't think it's really what this set is about, and I think, like, it's just slightly below average for that reason. Okie doke. Next up, we have Mirin Bardiche. Bardiche? Anyways, it's like that axe thing, that halberd. It's 4 and a white for artifact equipment at common, and it is Mirin, so you guessed it. This card has 4 Mirrodin! You have to shout it like that. So you get your 2/2, and the equipped creature gets +2/+1 and has vigilance. So this, basically, it's a 5 mana, 4/3 vigilance, and equip 3 and a white. So 5 mana, 4/3 vigilance, pretty overcosted, and then an expensive cost to give +2/+1 and vigilance. That is noticeable though, right? Like +2/+1 vigilance is impactful. Like your opponent has to deal with that creature on attacks, because otherwise it's also just on blocks. So it's a pretty powerful equip ability, but it is very, very clunky. I think this card at the end of the day is just fine. I think you can play this card. If you need a 5 mana card, it'll be okay. Notably, when you see a lot of these like 5 mana effects which are replaceable, then it just means you don't need to prioritize any of them, because I'm kind of happy with the 3/3 flyer that makes a couple 1/1s. I'm kind of happy with this card that makes a 4/3, and I can kind of move it around later on. But at the end of the day, I think it's kind of just a C-. I think it's replaceable. I think it's not quite in the D territory, because it does do enough. Like on a stalled board, this card can win the game on its own. So like it's a card I'm okay with in my deck. And it is important to be able to augment our creatures as it goes forward. And I think anytime you have these living weapon equipments, they always perform better than they read. So for that reason, it's still in the C camp, but it reads pretty bad. So I would give it a D, except that I know better, and it's going to do enough to earn that C-. Okay, our next card is Orthodoxy Enforcer. 3 and a white for a 2/4 Phyrexian Cleric at common. It has vigilance, and Orthodoxy Enforcer gets +2/+0 as long as you control 2 or more artifacts. In the picture, it's kind of cute. There's 2 little mites running around. So the joke is you have 2 mites and suddenly you get a 4 mana 4/4 vigilance. No, like 2/4 vigilance for 4 is not a good stat line. It blocks. 4/4 for 4 is good in white, but it doesn't play into the toxic stuff. Like if you have a bunch of these artifact creatures, you'd have to have the ones that like don't care about toxic, because otherwise it's just a 4/4. And you're sort of splitting like attacking with toxic versus not. I think this card has just too much tension built in for it to actually be good. And the stat line isn't even that impressive, right? Yeah, I know it's cute. It plays with mites, but the joke is it's not even that good. Like a 4 mana 4/4 is a good card. 4 mana 4/4 vigilance, but it's a lot of work to set up. I think you can do better. I'm going to give this card a D+. I think there's just going to be better 4 mana cards. At the end of the day, if you have to put this in your deck, it's fine. Like, it is a creature with power and toughness. But in 2023, I just need more out of my commons. So I could be completely wrong. Like, this is going to be an A-level card, and everyone's going to be like, oh, Orthodoxy Enforcer, I'm first picking it all the time. I don't think so, though. Okay, continuing our comment on uncommons, we have Ossification. It's 1 and a white for an aura at uncommon, and it says enchant basic land you control. So that's kind of weird. Why would we do that? Well, when Ossification enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. So this is an Oblivion Ring variant, and it goes on a land. And we're playing a ton of basics in Limited, so basically we don't have to worry about it being a basic. And so 1 and a white to remove anything is very mana inefficient, and your opponent can't get around this with those like flicker effects, right? Because this actually completely removes it until this leaves the battlefield. So your opponent has to have enchantment removal Or I guess land removal, so we can kind of keep an eye out for that, but that's really more sideboard. Ossification is just great. I think just a solid removal spell, super mana efficient, can hit everything. It's not really synergistic. I think for this card to really reach the upper echelons, then ossification. Like I'm gonna give this a B because it's so mana and if it's so mana efficient. Um, but I don't think it doesn't give anything else beyond that. For it to be like B plus A minus, you need to start getting like a body attached or something else for it to do that. Question, is this better than the common arrest? We're going to get to the common arrest soon. I think this is better because it's less vulnerable to flicker effects, bounce effects, sacrifice effects, those types of things. Like your opponent could sacrifice in response to ossification, but they have to do it immediately. They can't just like eventually draw a sacrifice outlet. So I think it's pretty solid. All right, next up, speaking of the arrest effect, here it is. It's Planar Disruption. It has the same mana cost. So it's 1 and a white for an enchantment aura at common. It enchants an artifact, creature, or planeswalker. An enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. So if we compare these two cards, the ossification gets rid of creatures and planeswalkers. The Planar Disruption gets rid of creatures and planeswalkers or artifacts too. So if your opponent has some sort of artifact with an activated ability, technically the Planar Disruption at common can be better, but it does have more vulnerabilities. So I think because this exists at common, the ossification gets a little bit worse. I gave it a B, but you can also kind of get it at common pretty similarly. But I do think Planar Disruption is a notch down for all those vulnerabilities we mentioned. Just having an aura sit around on your opponent's thing is just eventually going to cause problems. Oh, going on equipment, that is huge. That's true. But on the equipment themselves, like they've already gotten value a lot of the times off the equipment if you trade with their 4 Mirrodin creature. So like if you trade with your opponent and then you planar disruption their equipment itself, you're still getting 2 for 1 in that spot. So I wouldn't make that a huge knock against the planar disruption because oftentimes you're just going to be using it for other things anyways. Like it's almost better to like whatever big thing they put on the equipment, maybe you can just try to race your opponent. One of the big things about, and this is kind of a side tangent, but one of the big things you want to watch out for when playing with and against equipment is that just trading over time with the equipped creature is a good way to lose. So you have to find some other angle to fight that. So what I would say is that being able to interact with the big thing with planar disruption and finding a way to just lock down the ground with like a big butt creature or race your opponent is often going to be a better way to deal with it than just trading over and over again. And none of the equipment I've seen so far are like so good that we have to lock it down. This is a long-winded way to say I'm giving planar disruption a B minus and I'm giving ossification a B. I think they're pretty similar cards, and the fact that it can answer a planeswalker, both of them are pretty good because we're seeing planeswalkers at rare, which is a sign that it's much more in the set DNA than we're going to see normally. If we look back at War at the Spark, that was a set with uncommon planeswalkers, and they were literally core to the entire set, having one in every pack. This isn't going to be like that, but I think there's 10 planeswalkers or something in the set, so that's going to be way, way more. The thing about the planeswalkers, and we'll get to that with rares and mythics later, there's all the ones that were completed, which were like the Phyrexian planeswalkers. Those are all mythic rares, and then all the good hero planeswalkers are rares. So we'll get to those later, and the fact that planar disruption interacts with that is pretty nice. Okay. More white commons and uncommons. Okay, but we're rounding the corner here. Plated Onslaught is 3 white white. It's an instant and uncommon, and it has affinity for artifacts. So affinity, it costs less for each of that type. So affinity for artifacts means the spell costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. And for 5 mana, this instant gives creatures you control +2/+1 until end of turn. So I guess the joke is you can go wide and then you can play this and you can win combats. Now, it's an inspired charge variant, giving +2/+1 to everything is nice. I don't think the cost of inspired charge is what was ever holding that card back. If this card is good in your deck for going wide, it's good for going wide in your deck. I don't think the affinity for artifacts super matters. However, if you're going wide with mites anyways, those are artifact creatures. The chances are this card's going to cost white or one white frequently when you're going wide. What it does let you do is maybe it lets you double spell in a key turn and just like play this plus removal spell and go completely wide. So the cost reduction isn't nothing, but usually this type of card is the last card you play anyways, so I don't think it costing more or less really matters in terms of that. You'll know it if you want it, and I think the fact that there are token strategies in like the white color pairs, specifically I think green white and I think maybe white black too, basically the toxic go wide strategies, although black is more about sacrificing, so maybe not there. Maybe green white and white red, we'll see. Mostly green white I think is where this card's really going to shine. And it's just I don't want to oversell this effect because too often this effect looks like really good, like you think of the dream scenario, and too often it ends up not playing out to be as good as you think. The reason the version from Dominator United was so good was that it gave everything trample, and you just counted up. It was almost more like an overrun. Whereas if your opponent knows this is coming, they can kind of set up blocks to minimize it. And sometimes, you can mitigate that a little bit, but it's just like this card is only okay. So it has a really high ceiling. It just wins the game, but also has kind of a low floor. So I think at the end of the day, this card's just a C. I think it's solid. I think it's going to be better in like green white, but I don't think you just want to put Plated Onslaught in a random deck. All right, let me have a swig of water here. Splash. Okay. Porcelain Zealot. 3 and a white for a 2/3 Phyrexian soldier at uncommon. So we talked about creature sizing. So 4 mana for a 2/3, really bad. But it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If that creature has toxic, instead it gets +2/+2. Yeah, that's nice. So it immediately makes up for the creature sizing by giving that bonus to something else. And it basically has haste, right? You already have a toxic creature in play. You play this. You didn't have attacks before. You give that creature +2/+2. This card reads really strong. Like, even turning your 1/1 into a 3/3, that 1 mana, 1/1 toxic creature, the Porcelain Zealot here really is going to take over the game quickly. It only works on offense, so you need to make sure you're assertive. Because if you're trying to block, this card does nothing. But this is really, I think, quite a strong push, and white is really aggressive. So I think if you're having that assertive game plan in mind and you're prioritizing toxic creatures, this card is going to be in that B range. I'm going to give this a B-. It does still cost 4 mana, and it does get answered by, whatever removal spell, but I think it does crack that B range where it pushes those toxic creatures over the top. So I really like this card. Resistance Reunited is 1 and a white for an uncommon instant. It says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and it says equip creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. This is one of those combat tricks which takes a lot of setup to be able to get something out of it. Realistically, what this, like, to set this card up, you need a creature you're attacking with that's not equipped, and then hopefully another creature which is going to like trade in combat that is equipped, and then you play this to win a combat, and then you effectively get a 2-for-1. My problem with this card is that there's a common +2/+2 trick which pumps a toxic creature and already just gets a 2-for-1. So in my mind, most of the time this requires more setup and is worse than the common version of it. It can be better, and it works in different circumstances than the common toxic pump version. Because white red, there's that equipment matters themes. So there's going to be times where you have like 2 or 3 equipped creatures, and maybe this gives certain things indestructible, and you win a combat somewhere else. So it does have more upside than the common, but I think its floor is much lower. So for that reason, I'm a little bit more off on this card. It's still a decent combat trick. It's fine. But I think, I'm between like D+ and C-. I'm going to give it a C- build around because I think If you don't have equipped creatures, this card is basically like a D minus. So again, I'm going to give it that C minus build around where you kind of need like 2 or 3 equipments in your deck to even consider playing it. And most of the time, it's probably not going to make the cut. You'd much rather have the common pump spell. Okay, Sinew Dancer is our next one. It's a single white mana for a 1/1 Phyrexian Soldier at common. And it's Tapper, which is cool. We haven't seen a Tapper in too often. It's three. It has 3 and a white tap to tap target creature. So a single white mana for a 1/1 that you can pay 4 mana to tap target creature. Not a very good rate. Not really impressive, and I don't think you would really play that card very often. I mean, every once in a while you might play it. That's like a D level card, but it has corrupted. So if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, you can instead pay a single white mana and tap it to tap target creature. That's really good. The key about tappers is mana efficiency. If they're 1 to tap, it's really, really good. Because you can just slot that 1 mana into your curve wherever and still develop your board, do whatever else you're going to do. 2 mana, it's a little iffy, but still, I think, pretty good. Like, you'll play that most of the time. And then 3 or more, it's like way too expensive. So this card, you really, really, really want to have the corrupted bonus. But what I will say that's nice about it is, let's say your opponent only has like 1 poison counter or 2 poison counters. You're not at the corrupted yet. You can invest in the Sinew Dancer like once at the more expensive rate. You're going to pay 4 and tap it. You can tap down their blocker, hit them with your toxic creature, and then it's going to get you to that corrupted state. And then from there on out, it just snowballs where you can now only pay 1 mana. So I can see this card being like really, really strong, being a role player. Also, the thing with tappers is a common play pattern. On your opponent's turn, you can tap their best thing. Then if you're being aggressive enough and you're ahead enough, you can also tap down a key blocker on your turn. So every other turn cycle, it's almost like it's tapping down 2 things. Or you can just be really aggressive with it and just keep tapping something down on your turn, or you can play it on defense, right? Where if you're behind, you can just tap down their biggest threat. The one problem with Sinew Dancer is if you're behind, then you weren't getting through with your toxic creatures, which means your Sinew Dancer costs 4 mana to tap. So you have to make sure that you can get your toxic creatures through early and often so that your Sinew Dancer can be cheap enough, because then as the corrupted state, it's really, really good. I really like this card. I'm going to give it a C. I think you do have to do some work, because the version where it's not corrupted, it's not very good. But the second you turn it on, it's really quite fantastic. So it really synergizes with all the other common toxic creatures we've seen. And I think you want to take your toxic creatures before your Sinew Dancer, like the good ones. Because if you just end up with a pile of Sinew Dancers and not the good toxic creatures, then Sinew Dancer is going to kind of fall flat. But it is really, really solid, I think. Next up, we have Swooping Lookout. Single white mana for a 1/2 artifact creature, Phyrexian Construct at uncommon. And pretty simple. It has Flying and Vigilance. It has horrifying art. There's like rows of teeth everywhere, and I'm scared to look at it. But a 1 mana 1/2 Flying Vigilance is fine. I mean, it blocks might tokens. You can pump it up, but it doesn't have Toxic. And so this doesn't play well with white's other cards. You can pump it up with the equipment, but most of the equipment is clunky. So I think this card actually just is not going to be that great. We've seen a world where 1-drops have gotten a lot better, but I don't think this quite fits the bill on that. So for Swooping Lookout, I gotta just say, like, I think it's playable, but it's really quite filler, I think. Unless for some reason I'm missing something with the ways that you can pump it up. I'm going to give it a D. Technically, it's like filler that you could put in your deck, but I don't think you're going to be happy with this card. It has a few uses, like stopping mites. It has sideboard uses, but it's just a little small. And so until we see ways we can pump it up, I'm going to start on D with this card. All right, Vanish into Eternity. Okay, so there's a card that might combo with Swooping Lookout later. So if you get the combos with a 1 mana 1/2 that you can pump up, then go for it. Vanish into Eternity is 2 and a white for a common instant, and it exiles target non-land permanent. So that's pretty nice. 3 mana, answer anything. That's pretty crazy. But the catch is, this spell costs 3 more to cast if it targets a creature. So most of the time, this is going to be a 6 mana remove target creature at instant speed. Being instant is huge because you can just hold up this card. Um, Also, we've seen a lot of equipment. So actually, this is a pretty clean answer. Like, if you have a creature that sizes nicely against your opponent's 2/2 that their equipment's attached to, and you can pay 3 mana to exile the equipment and block, or you attack into that, whatever, it's a pretty clean 1-for-1, so that's a pretty good answer. It also obviously answers all the planeswalkers, all those. It answers all the auras that are running around for 3 mana, like the ossifications, that kind of thing. There's some nice build around artifacts that we'll see later on that this answers. So it just does a lot, and then on top of that, it's a 6 mana remove any creature, which I think is fine. I think because there is the arrest at common, this card loses a little bit of its value because white already has a really efficient play. But I think including one Vanish into Eternity into a deck is just totally reasonable. Eventually, usually you're going to get to 6 mana. You're going to be able to answer their bombs. And the fact that this set cares about planeswalkers and all these non-creature artifacts, non-creature permanents, makes Vanish into Eternity quite a bit better. So all that being said, what is it? I think it's like a C. Like, it has all its use cases. You're usually happy to play one, but it's nothing like insane or something you want to go out of your way for. Yeah, I think you could. I think you could not start a Vanish into Eternity. I think there's enough snowbally things and things that are key pieces that you're building around that I think being able to interact with your opponent is going to be important. Um, and this is the type of card that's really not good at answering cheap, efficient things, but it is going to be quite a bit better against the expensive stuff. And if you happen to need removal, this card gets quite a bit better. If you already have a lot of cheap interaction, you definitely don't need to start it. All right, and also that's why I gave it a C rather than like B, B minus, which is the other removal spells, which are so efficient. Our next white uncommon here is Veil of Assimilation. It's 1 and a white for an artifact. And it says, whenever Veil of Assimilation or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, target creature control gets +1/+1 and gains vigilance until end of turn. So it gives a temporary boost, but you want to keep putting artifacts into play. This card is a build around, right? If you have a ton of artifacts and specifically care, I think, about toxicking to push your creatures through, I could see this card get there. It also gives vigilance, which is nice because then you get to also have your creatures on blocks. And this counts itself. So when it comes into play, it probably makes a good attack the turn it comes down. So normally I think these types of effects do too little for their mana cost. But the fact that you just get it immediately is a huge boon to this type of effect. Oftentimes, with these build arounds that like want you to do certain things, it's like they're counting on other things or you have to hit a certain threshold. This says, no, I'm going to give you the bonus right away. And then also anytime you get another artifact, it's going to bonus that. And the real key thing about the Veil of Assimilation, it's really good with all the mites. So like anytime you put a mite into play, is then going to pump up your other toxic creature you're going to attack through. And your opponent's suddenly going to rack up these poison counters that you're not expecting. All that being said, this is really a build around card. And I think basically if you have like 9+ artifacts, this card's pretty solid. I think if you have this plus like 2 other artifacts in your deck, is just not worth playing. But you can count artifacts a lot of different ways. Like if something makes mites, as long as it's not like a death trigger, this can count for that. Or any artifacts itself. So it's not that hard, I think, to get to like 9 if you're trying. I think it's like a build around C+. If your deck really enables it, it's going to be a pretty good card. I think if you can't enable it, you only have like 3 artifacts in your deck, it's pretty much just an F. I don't think a one-shot +1/+1 vigilance is that good. So C+ build around for Veil of Assimilation. And then Zealot's Conviction. Zealot's Conviction is single white mana for a enchantment or at common. It has flash. It enchants a creature, and an enchanted creature gets +1/+1. But it also has Corrupted. As long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, enchanted creature gets an additional +1/+0 and has first strike. Kind of think of Military Discipline with this card, except that it gets the first strike permanently. But for this card to grant first strike in the first place, you have to have the Corrupted. What I really like about this card, though, is you can win the combat for the +1/+1. Like if the creature sizing matches up nicely, like your opponent has, they have a 2/2, you have a 2/2, you attack, they block, you turn your thing into a 3/3. Then eventually, you're going to get the +1/+0 first strike from the corrupted. If your opponent's already corrupted, this creature gets +2/+1 in first strike for a single white mana and sticks on the creature. It's so cheap and efficient. I think these types of effects often get overlooked because there's that inherent aura disadvantage, but Military Discipline in Brothers War was really good. And I think this card's going to have like a similar effect. I think this card's actually like pretty solid. You want to punch your toxic creatures through. And so I think this card's going to function like a C+ a lot of the time. That's the grade I'm going to give it. I don't think you want to pick it that highly because you only have so many combat tricks, and there's some good ones here. Makes that indestructible combat trick we talked about even worse that this exists. And I think you're going to get these late because people are going to kind of overlook this effect. It's historically overlooked. But yeah, I'm going to give this a C+. But it's kind of the C+ type card where you almost want it to wheel and then you pick them up because there is inherent risk to the card. But I think this card is like a 1-mana card that can kind of just snowball games. So I'm pretty happy to play them as long as I can reliably get corrupted on my opponent's stuff. All right, so next up we're going to move to blue. I'm going to take a quick stretch break, and I'll be back in just a minute, and we'll keep on going from there. Thanks for hanging out, everyone. I'm having a lot of fun here. We're on slide 42 of 262. So yeah, buckle in. I'll be right back.